Sorry, is it okay? Okay, sorry, I'll carry on. We've been doing this since about 2001 or 2002. Certainly in 2002, we held the first conference or workshop on learning with mobiles. And so there's a considerable amount of evidence originally from maybe the UK, Western Europe, Southern Africa, maybe South Africa mostly, the Asia Pacific, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and patches elsewhere, Athabasca in Canada, places in India. So there's a kind of lot of evidence of our experiences, our projects, our pilots, but it's very skewed in the sense it's pretty much all English speaking, and often it grows out of the English or the UK education system, either directly or through its ex-colonies. And it's often a kind of artifact or a function of the way it gets funded. And originally it was driven by research questions coming out of the EdTech or the e-learning community. So on the one hand, I'd like to say there is a lot of evidence, there has been a lot of activity, there are a lot of practitioners, activists and researchers. We ought to be able to learn something from what they've done. Sadly, I think we often learn the wrong things because the ways in which the projects and the pilots have been spread has not been systematic, even, comprehensive. And there are vast patches, Russia, China, South America, where we've actually made relatively small inroads, or we haven't actually managed to connect with the practitioners out there, or listen to work in their language rather than our language. Okay, so there's a lot of work. It is skewed, partial, subjective, and actually problematic, because what we've seen is small-scale pilots, and now we get a lot of pressure to scale them up. We've seen pilots in one part of the world, and we get a lot of pressure to move them to other parts of the world. We've seen lots of small-scale activity that has been subsidized, and we get lots of pressure to make it sustainable. So in looking back at what we've done over the last 15 or so years, and in trying to learn something from it, I think we ought to be very, very cautious and understand there's probably not much that we actually can learn from it, apart from, vigilance, scrutiny and caution, really, in thinking about the future whilst we look at the past. Having said all of that, I suppose one of my activities has been trying to understand all of this activity, and maybe understand in the sense of categorize or classify it. So when we chose the title Enriches Learning, there are a number of other options. Yes, I think we can demonstrate that we have enriched learning, and that's what I'll talk about, but I think we've also managed to do a few other things as well, and one of those is actually extend learning. So we've managed to reach out to people or communities or countries where other educational interventions have been impossible, expensive, dangerous or difficult. But I'm not talking about that. I think we've also managed to challenge educational thinking and educational theorizing. But I'm not talking about that either. And I think we've also demonstrated, or we'd certainly like to think we've demonstrated, that actually we've encouraged learning, that we've had the most effect and the most impact with people who are disengaged, disenfranchised and disadvantaged as learners, and bring them back into the system, bring them back into learning. But okay, to get back to the original title, and that was Enrich. And so, okay, partly having said, I'd like to classify what we do and maybe, enrich, extend, theorize and encourage, focus on the enrich. These slides are actually then an attempt to classify further the enrichment part of it and say, how does that break down? And so I think one of the first things we've managed to do is make learning more, well, I've called it contingent, but I've also heard people call it agile, more reactive and responsive to the real world out there, so that whereas field trips and field work used to be very unresponsive and it used to be a matter of recording data and processing it, now we can actually use these technologies to encourage people to be more curious, to think like scientists, to have a hypothesis, to gather more data, to think what the hypothesis is telling them, to test that hypothesis. So this particular slide is from nuclear power station, where students examine pollution. And they can actually take measurements, think about whether it's wind speed, air temperature, rainfall that governs pollution in one direction or another, and test that hypothesis to go out and have another go. And where everything was done offline or back in a study centre, that kind of thing wasn't possible. They can actually process data, capture more raw data, and think again about what they understand and what they hypothesize about a situation. And actually, this is would seem to be a completely different example, but it's the example of what we sometimes call personal response systems. Those systems which in a lecture theatre allow students to react, to tell the lecturer or the facilitator or the instructor what their answers, their reactions, their attitudes are to what they're hearing and what they're trying to learn, giving the lecturer the opportunity to change, to rehearse, to repeat, to move faster, to move slower, to say it a different way. And again, to make it more contingent or agile, it depends on what's going on there and then. It's not the lecturer going through their script without any deviation, reaction, or response. So in terms of my classification of enriching learning, the first enrichment, I think, is the ways in which we've made it more contingent, more reactive, responsive, and agile. The second one, again, vast field of possibilities, but is all of those learning activities that involve professional, on-the-job training. So, for example, nurses, teachers in training, vets, any of those professional courses where the people studying have to go into the real environment, into a hospital, into a doctor's practice, into a zoo, into a veterinary surgery, into a school, in order to develop their professional practice, but actually having devices with them that allow them to capture their reactions, their reflections, to work on their assessments and their assignments, to capture video and audio, to keep in touch with their colleagues and their tutors. All of these affordances mean that experience becomes much more richer, engaged, and I suppose what we'd actually say is situated and authentic. It's meaningful in a way that watching a video, being in a classroom, is not meaningful. It's out there where it's live and messy, but where they've got the support and the materials and the content and the connections to actually give it meaning whilst learning on the job. Okay, so that was an example of what you might call using the technology to make learning more, as I say, authentic and situated, to take it out of the classroom, out of the institution, into where it actually needs to be relevant. And then this example and a couple of others are what we call contextual learning. So this is maybe the classic experiment in the early days of using mobiles, where you could take them into art galleries, you could take them into heritage sites, cultural sites, and because they have various kinds of location awareness, they're actually able to feed information to the learner or the visitor or the student about where they are, about the painting they're standing in front of, about the plants they're looking at, about the castle or the monument or the museum. And it's not programmed, it's not scripted, it depends on where they are, how long they're there, and where they've been previously. So what we have is audio material or video material that responds to their situation, to their context, to where they are, and also to where they've been. So it gives the possibility that, okay, they've been standing in front of this painting in the Uffizi in Florence. What else have they been looking at? Where have they been? Can the technology figure out what they like and what they don't like? Can it make recommendations? Okay, so you've just been through the Canalettos. Would you like to know where more Canalettos are? Would you like to know about Canaletto? Would you like to see his biography? Would you like to pull down an episode from Wikipedia that would tell you about Canaletto, Caravaggio, or whoever? And okay, this has been a very limited set of projects that have been constrained by time and money and resources, but we can see ways in which now that learners and visitors can not only consume this information, but contribute to it. You know, to turn it from a web 1.0 experience of being in a museum where you consume to a Web 2.0 experience where you contribute, where you can add your own reactions, reflections, images, audio, that's going to be situated in that spot for subsequent visitors who will then not only experience the original artifact and the original educational material, but also an accumulating selection of other stuff from other visitors, how they appreciated and understood and reacted to their surroundings. And you can do this indoors, and you can see here, this is in North London. It's a formal education course, not a informal visit to a museum, doing town planning, civic planning, looking at street plans where the students have maybe information drawn from historical, cultural resources about the area, and where they can go from place to place as part of an assessment. And the information they're getting is, I suppose, personalised. It's relevant to them because it's where they are, and it's relevant to their trajectory through that environment. And then that takes us on to not just adding information that's contextual, but ideas about augmenting reality. So in this particular slide, what you're seeing is a street scene, bollards, road, pavement, building, and the mobile phone's being used as a viewfinder, as a camera phone. But it's picking up some contextual information about its location, and it's superimposing the image of the car. So the car isn't, in a sense, really there, but this image of the car is completely convincing in the sense that you can walk up to it, walk round it, get closer, get further away, change the inclination, but in that sense, it will always be convincing. And maybe in a set for a lot of these, I haven't actually talked about the educational implications. In some ways, that's because there are so many, and it's really, increasingly we see the need to put this in the hands of the educators and say, okay, this is what it does, but what does it do for you? So, okay, we can do street scenes indoors, and this might be very, 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 very cheap. This might be just QR codes. We've seen both contextual learning and augmented reality learning used for make-believe reenactments, murder mysteries, literary scenes from Jane Austen and Jane Eyre, all sorts of things. And in fact, in terms of the curriculum, the possibilities are really quite astonishing, all the way from landscape sorts of studies, archaeology, zoology, geography, geology, to English literature and history. An obvious one in the consumer market is those apps that show you the star maps. So we're talking about astronomy, various experiments in physics, you name it, and it's either done or you'll do it fairly soon. And this is the same sort of thing, if you like, as a collective experience. It's Dam Square in Amsterdam with extra people, toys, whatever, characters superimposed into the technology. I think, is that Darth Vader? I've never noticed that before. Yeah, so okay, so that's outdoor, indoor, outdoor, formal, informal. We can do it or it'll happen soon. And increasingly, as you look at these examples, you'll see, I suppose, a sort of historical trend from what was small-scale, expensive, unusual and difficult to what is basically retail. You can download these apps, and increasingly you're not working with an unusual and fragile hardware handset technology. You're working with something that's ubiquitous and universal, and so if you're looking at sustainability, some of these problems are going away. The technology is becoming cheap and easier and robust. All of your students will own this stuff in terms of handsets and connectivity. So in the sense of how the challenge might have moved, it's moved from things that were really difficult technically to things that are still challenging educationally. And this finally is the Berlin Wall. This is the Brandenburg Gate. But what's no longer there is the Berlin Wall itself, which runs across the top of this slide. And again, you can move in, you can move back, you can tilt, you can walk round. it'll be there and it'll convince you. So again, lots of educational possibilities. So to go back to my broader classification or categorization of what we've done, I think we've demonstrated in a variety of ways that I haven't mentioned how we can extend the reach of education to people with cognitive or physiological disabilities, or with where distance or infrastructure or sparsity are problems, rural communities of, for example, women in traditional communities where going into class, going into college are problematic. We can reach out to all of them. And as I say, we can enrich their experience in the ways I've been describing. We can also encourage and enthuse disenfranchised and disadvantaged learners. But what we're seeing now, as the technology becomes more popular, more ubiquitous, more easy, I suppose, is the fact that it's moving away from the professions and the institutions of education. The technology is enabling people to create their own learning. So if we look at these, there's a vast amount of podcast material, and it's not coming from within the institutions of education. It's coming from interest groups, individuals, crackpots, who knows, but there's masses of it. So this would have been the slide that Michelle saw in Cairo, just pointing out that if you want to know about Ottoman history or learn to speak Arabic, which I still struggle with, there's a podcast for it. There's a series of them. There's a choice of them. And actually maybe an interesting sideline is the way that the education they offer is not authorized or authoritative in the way it would be when you see a professional educator and they've got qualifications, but it's actually reviewed in the way that Amazon reviews things. This comes from iTunes, and maybe these are the ones with 4.5 stars or 5 stars. Instead of the wisdom of the profession, what you've got is the wisdom of the crowd, which may be as faulty as any other wisdom, but it's how people do these things these days. And then you've got the example of citizen journalism, where what we have here is a picture taken during London bombings of July 2005, where, again, knowledge, information, learning are coming from within the population, within the audience, from within the consumers. And this wasn't produced by the BBC. This was just produced by people with camera phones using YouTube, and ostensibly it's more democratic. It hasn't been filtered or monitored by the BBC or the Ministry of Information, but it's learning and it's knowledge, and it's out there and it's accessible. And it enriches learning, and it also challenges learning, because we need our students, our people, to be much more critical about all of this stuff. There's a vast abundance of it that's enriching learning, but our students need greater critical skills to access the good stuff and know the bad stuff, and to understand the subtext. So this was actually taken by a Londoner, and the story is about how plucky Londoners are when people bomb their metro. But there's another story which could have equally have well been spun about this was a jihadist triumph, which, in the wake of the shootings in Paris last week, you can understand how potent those different messages are and how they enrich what we know and what we learn, but also how they challenge our skills as educators to do something with it. And then, of course, the more obvious source is just YouTube, Flickr, Wikipedia. For most of the world, their mobile phone is access to the web, to the World Wide Web. It's how they gain information, how they join communities, how they contribute. So, it enriches learning, but not in the way that necessarily we professionals understand how learning works. This might be something from Star Trek saying, "This is learning, but not as we know it, Captain." There's a different category, the kind of popular Web 2.0 learning coming from amongst the learners, where the learners become their own teachers. And then there's the example from Sugatra Mitra. This is not mobile. It's a monitor and a browser and controls built into an Indian village wall. But it illustrates Sugatra Mitra's experiment allowing Indian kids access to the World Wide Web. And that's effectively what mobiles do. You don't need to put a monitor in a concrete wall anymore. Everyone's got a mobile. Sorry, almost everyone has got a mobile, and probably knows how to use it. They may not know how to use it well, and they may not know how to use it critically, and that might be one of the problems. I mean, these kids could be accessing pornography, or they could be accessing sites that tell them the world is flat. And you might also notice the girl is the one standing at the back. You know, so this is not simple and uncomplex. And then you've got the MOOC phenomenon, which has become, I suppose, certainly in the UK, and from what I gather in the US as well, massively monetized, corporatized. But what some of us originally did with a MOOC, and this was our original one for mobile learning, was just to use popular and free resources and to connect people to each other. You know, we had a blizzard of interaction for 3 weeks with 600 people. So again, no formal structure, but nevertheless there was learning, and there were people in the community engaged with each other. So those are ways in which, two ways in which really the kind of Web 2.0 and the original enrichment idea, two categories of ways we've enriched learning. Slightly challenged by the fact that, of course, mobiles not only deliver or enhance learning, but they also change the need and the nature of it. So if we look at performance support tools, they're actually tools that help you do your job. Now, if they help you do your job, and originally you were educated in order to do your job, you know, that's one of the reasons for education, to service the economy. So how does that change the nature of jobs and work if mobiles are changing the nature of the economy into which all of our learners, now students, go? I mean, it's still something we're going to take a long time to figure out. But there's more of a dynamic merely than just the suggestion that mobiles enrich learning but don't change it. I think they fundamentally change it. And this is an example from Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which you can refer to at your leisure if you really want to, but it's the example of something he calls a babel fish, which was some small animal which intergalactic travellers could put in their ears, and it would do all of the language translation for them. Okay, so that's performance support. That's what the technology is almost doing already. That's what Google Translate and all sorts of other services are just about to do. So what does that do to the nature of language learning? Does that enrich it, or just invalidate it? And if there's that technology support and replace language learning, no doubt the same is true for other kinds of learning as well. So not only do we see enrichment, but we see transformation and challenge. And of course, we have the multiplicity of apps that will do things that maybe our brains used to do, or maybe our teachers used to help us do. Okay, so there is a challenge to how the enrichment of learning is taking place and who's controlling it. And then I think this might be one of the last couple of slides, the idea that, well, certainly in most of Western Europe, but also clearly Africa and South Asia, however good mobiles might be for helping people learn, the school system, the state, the schools can't afford to give everyone a mobile, a tablet, a device. So we need to think about what's now called the bring your own device scenario. And one portrayal of that is it's saving money. All that you do is let the learners put their devices in the place that used to be occupied educationally by the ones that the schools and the colleges provided. That's clearly not the case. The devices in question and the software and the systems and the communities that the devices come with are all under the control of the learners, no longer under the control of the teachers. So what we see is, okay, bring your own device might be a cute technical financial solution to greater interactivity and enrichment of learning using mobiles, but it also shifts the nature of control. The slide is a reference to someone calling it letting the animals run the zoo. So again, it's changing the nature of learning, but maybe shifting the control, the agency, and the nature of learning from what we'd expected, what we grew up with, and maybe what we felt comfortable with. So I'll finish there. I've no idea of the time, but I'll let Michelle put us back in contact and see if anyone's got any questions.
I put one question into the chat box.
Yeah, sure. Oh, thanks. An interesting question, and it's one I discuss about once a day. I think from my formulation, the idea of flipped learning or the flipped classroom is basically asking us as educators, what exactly is the unique reason for us interacting face-to-face with students? And it's clearly not that they want to sit in a lecture with 300 other students listening to us reciting our PowerPoint slides. So what's the reason for them being there, and what's the reason for them being there with us that is irreducible and irreplaceable? And I think mobiles and other technologies, I mean, not just the mobiles, but actually the software and the networks and the connectivity and all the rest of it, actually allow us to answer that question in a far more critical way, and to say that, you know, we can let a lot of learning happen off campus, off site, not face to face, and hopefully that clears the way for stuff that we as people, as teachers, can uniquely give it. But how that works out in any particular country and any particular culture is clearly different. I'm sure expectations and maturity can be quite problematic. You know, we have conservative employers, conservative managers, conservative politicians who might think this is just a license for teachers not to do anything, or to do even less. And so we need to think it through quite carefully, and to challenge existing practices, and to I suppose basically we need evidence, and we need to demonstrate that this is a worthwhile proposition, that somehow education is becoming richer and maybe more efficient by flipping the classroom, but by looking at exactly what that means in any particular context. But I think even if the idea is, if you like, completely hollow, you know, and meaningless, I think it's an interesting challenge. You know, why are we and our students meeting together in the same building face to face? You know, we need to know the answer.
Did you have a question? One sec, we have a question in here, I think. Did you?
Okay.
Yeah, a couple of questions. Okay. With what we were just talking about with flipped learning, it's a lot easier to move the content delivery out of the lecture. It's more difficult for faculty and students to actually figure out what to do face-to-face then. So, I mean, do you have any suggestions for how to approach that? It's a lot easier for the students and the faculty to slip into that default, more passive mode.
Yeah, okay. And, sorry, I wouldn't claim any expertise on the notion of the flipped classroom at all. And I certainly wouldn't, in a sense, claim any expertise in other people's educational systems. But I think there are two things going on in this question. One is actually what would be an appropriate formulation for the flipped classroom, for example, in your context. But the other is actually the one about the management of change. So you might be able to create a convincing, rigorous and satisfying formula. You know, we'll do this way and we'll do that some other way. But that still begs the question about, okay, how do you get to that situation? You know, how do you deal with traditionalists or conservatives or people who are nervous, or regulatory systems which may be quite unhelpful, qualification and exam systems that may not be very helpful either. I mean, however rich the learning got, if you still go back to a 3-hour sit-down written exam, you might feel you're wasting your time, you know, that the innovation was actually fairly pointless. So I guess, yeah, I would imagine that we're at a very experimental stage, and the challenge is almost not so much imagining utopia, but actually formulating the trajectory that will get us there. That's probably an unsatisfying answer, but at least I feel comfortable with it. No hostages to fortune.
Okay, just a moment. I'll see if anyone else has a question. All right, there's no more questions from this end. Anyone online, did you have any questions?
No.
All right, well, if you want to wrap up, thanks so much for your talk. That was, I know that I just wanted to make one comment is we do some nonprofit work in Kenya, and we work with this Maasai group, actually. And the thing that always shocked me when we go there, when we go to visit them, we're trying to help them build a well for water because they have no water. They have no electricity. The villagers, these Maasai villagers live in mud huts. And the lead Maasai warrior that we work with and sort of, locally to help do some of the kind of local policy and work to get the well built, he's got 2 mobile phones, but he has no electricity. He has to walk miles into town to charge it occasionally. So we bought him a solar charger and a bunch of these Maasai warriors herding their cattle around the savannas of Africa, they've got mobile phones, and that really shocked me. It really showed me the ubiquitous of mobile learning. Like you were saying, that way to get access to learning and information to people who not only previously, but today would not have it any other way. They just, there is not ever going to be electricity all over Africa for a very long time. They're just too poor. And so the mobile phones is really bringing those opportunities to people that absolutely never had it before. And that was really impressed upon me there.
Oh, sure. And I think, I've done work in Kenya, and I think it reveals quite a few interesting features. The world's largest mobile banking system is based in Kenya, and it didn't start in Western Europe. It started with Safaricom in Kenya. So, and it's the world's largest mobile banking system grows out of a mobile telecom network, not out of the finance and banking sector. So you can see how, even at that level, mobiles are changing the nature of employment and the economy. When I was there, the technologists we were working with, they specialized in working with mobile technology to support learning or anything else. And again, you can see if people are coming out of the University of Nairobi with a computer science degree, are they going to do computing or are they going to do phones? They're going to work with mobiles because that's their technology. There's an awful lot of talent, and you hear the GSMA, who are the cartel for the network operators, saying, this is where our next billion subscribers are. So there is all kinds of big business to be made out there as well. But on the other hand, I remember at one conference in Africa saying I thought Africa was probably safe from learning with computers because actually they get stolen. There isn't the electricity. But I'm much more concerned about whether Africa is safe from learning with mobiles, because they're a ubiquitous, pervasive, and intrusive technology that no one even notices. And it's very easy to think that in order to transmit learning to distant and impoverished communities, all we need to do is pump down large amounts of content. So you can see the work of, for example, World Reader in Kenya, where they're distributing ebook readers, but they're originally distributing ebook readers with English. And it's taken them quite some while to work round to Swahili and then to work round to mother tongues. So there is a concern, if you like, that the technology scales up and the content scales up, and therefore we don't need to worry about the marginal issues about kind of culture and pedagogy. Actually, these people may have their own ways of learning, and we need to adapt and resonate with those as well, apart from thinking, we've done it first and we do it best. Sorry, that was a rant.
No, but I think you're right. It's a good point in that as you move into different, multicultural groups, even in the U.S., we have a lot of students from different countries and cultures, and sometimes we don't realize that they do learn in different ways and they have different ways of approaching it, and it's good to keep that in mind. Yeah,
and they use different languages, and they use different characters, different fonts, different gestures, everything. So although we hear global agencies talking about localization, sadly what they often mean is translating it from English, which is not quite the same as translating it from Esperanto or Latin. There's cultural baggage that you can't just filter out. even if you change the language. Anyway, as I say, that was polemic. Inexcusable.
So are there any other questions for John in here? Any comments? Yeah, do you have a comment? Yeah, you're good. Everyone here really enjoyed the talk. Thank you very much for your time today, John.
Okay, pleasure.
We're going to be screencasting this, and we'll send you a link when the video is made.
Okay.
All right.
Yep,
Thank
goodbye.
you so